Hi, Jeff Ryan, strength and conditioning coach at Winona State University. Today we're going to talk about that seasonal transition. We're going from one season to another season. In this case, it's from fall to winter. And what does that mean? Well, up here in the upper Midwest, that means one of two things. You could be transitioning from a sport such as football or volleyball or one of the typical fall sports into what would be more of a traditional winter sport. It could be men's or women's basketball. It could be wrestling. A wide variety of different sports that occur in the wintertime, just depending where you're from. But here's what we're going to look at from the strength and conditioning standpoint. What does that mean? Well, first, let's take the individual who's going to go from a fall sport, we'll say football, and sliding into what is a traditional off season for them. They don't have a winter sport, they don't have a spring sport. They're just going from football, and they're going to try to prepare themselves either for the next level or for the following year. As a strength coach, that's a great time for us. Because we really get to hit our true kind of off season, the time to really put some strength on an individual, some size on an individual, depending on who they are, if they're male, female, what sport they might be looking at in the near future. But it's our time to be able to do that. And what does that mean? Well, first thing I always like to do is, again, look back at our traditional technique types of things. So review the squat if you're doing those, front, back, overhead, whatever it might be. The different explosive movements such as a clean, such as a snatch. Anything that you're doing that takes a little bit of technique, make sure you review those before you just jump right in. The other thing it usually means is a lot more volume, which means higher reps overall and higher intensity. So it's really kind of a fun time. It's time to get for your typical weight room guy. It's time to get big. It's time to put that size on, that mass on, be able to do those things. But it's also a great time for the strength side and the conditioning side to be able to blend. Again, it really depends on what that individual is going to do next. But now, if you're looking to go from sport to another sport, which happens frequently in a lot of schools, somebody will be in, we'll say either football or volleyball in the fall, and now they're transitioning into, it might be wrestling, it might be gymnastics, it could be basketballs, something that might be similar, but yet it might be very different. So there's some things to consider at this point. First of all, do you need to make any changes to your program? What are some of the typical needs that you might need to do? Well, if I'm going from a volleyball program into a gymnastics program for an athlete, things I might want to consider are what are the highest injury rates that we need to concern ourselves with? In volleyball and gymnastics, some things might be similar. You might see a lot of shoulder issues. So you might spend a little bit more time prehabbing, rehabbing, different movements that are going to help strengthen the entire shoulder area. On the other side, it might be kind of different. You might see some significant hip, low back, knee types of things that can go along with gymnastics simply because of what they're due. That might be slightly different than it would be in volleyball. But again, kind of look at those, speak with your coaches, see if there's things that you need to really focus on. Another sport that you might transition from, as I said earlier, was maybe football to wrestling. Again, similar, but yet very different. Again, you might have a lot of shoulder injuries. You might have a lot of lower body injuries. Wrestling presents itself a little bit different than football. Obviously, the impacts aren't quite as great, but there's a lot of different torquing and things on the body that a wrestler can go through that might be somewhat similar and yet somewhat different when it comes to football. But look at those sports. See what those needs are. Try to make sure that you're addressing those at the same time, simply because they've come from now an in-season sport where they're kind of winding to the end, and now they're jumping into the beginnings of a sport. Remember what coaches like to do frequently. They like to really condition the heck out of their athletes early on. Obviously, before they're hitting competition, they're doing these types of things. Make sure that your weight room programs reflect that, or at least envelop the idea of that. So you're really not kind of overloading an athlete. They're just coming off of a season. They might need to actually have some recovery time as opposed to just really hammer them hard if they're jumping into a sport such as gymnastics, basketball, or wrestling. So make sure that those dovetail together very nicely. Make sure that you have your thought process in place. You've talked with the coaches. You found out, is that a coach that really likes to push their athletes hard at the front end, really trying to condition them, getting them to really ready to go, particularly in a sport that I've been around, wrestling. Coaches love to do that. They're just real grinder kind of athletes. Make sure that our weight room is not making it more difficult for that to occur. Kids got to recover at the end of the day. The athletes got to recover to get that strength back, to let that repair go on, all those different types of things. So again, If you're going from, a sport time to a complete open season or an off-season time, you can build that strength. It's awesome. It's great. They get all the recovery that they want, and yet you can kind of hit them hard in the weight room. But if they're going from sport to sport, be very careful not to overload them in the weight room, not to front end that too much, because they might do a lot of conditioning in their current sport. So think about those things as you move forward. Good luck. Stay safe.